Yes, hi, James Kalm, your half-assed reporter, and we are at the Whitney. We're going to take a little walk through of the David Wojnarowicz show, History Keeps Me Awake at Night. I'm going to do a little different approach to this. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work and also read some passages from a fantastic book, Fire in the Belly, The Life and Times of David Wojnarowicz by Cynthia Carr. This is a self-portrait by David, and in a certain way it captures a lot of the themes that he worked with throughout his entire career. He was a kind of self-obsessed person, so a lot of his work are self-portraits. This is one of his pieces. He did the Rambo mask and got his friends and himself to go around town and take photographs of them wearing the mask. This is going to be kind of interesting because we're going to be able to see the arc of his career. And this is the first gallery. So I believe this is in the late 70s, early 80s, and he was actually a rock and roller, kind of a punk rocker, and he had a group called 3 Teens Kill 4, and that was one of the posters. He was also working with the technique of stencils and was actually doing this out on the streets and also in the West Side Piers, an area where there was a lot of rough trade, drug use, gay hustlers and things like that. And he was actually pretty prolific with that, but there was a couple of symbols that he used to get in again, images. The burning house was one. Okay, this is a series of work that he did where he was using supermarket posters, and I looked at this and I thought to myself that this made me think of the détournement, which was a technique used by the Situationists International, and I believe that David spent 6 or 9 months in Paris in the late 70s before he came to the East Village, and he might have been influenced by them. Also, as we saw, his Rambo mask and maybe some Jean Genet images as well. I think he kind of had a soft spot for the French transgressive avant-garde, the avant-garde of the resistance. And this piece is titled Diptych, 1982, spray paint, acrylic, and collage on board, and it's 48 by 96 inches. Now, he was pretty much self-taught, and he had a very rough childhood. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And they were saying that he was also pretty hard up for money, so a lot of his materials he just had to find things that he could use. So these supermarket window posters were popular. Also, that's a trash can lid. And again, here are more of his repertory of symbols that he used. I think this piece is titled Prison Rape, 1984. This is 48 by 48, spray paint, collage, and acrylic on composition board. And yeah, you can see his little wanted posters that he's collected and pasted on as a ground. As I was saying, I think that there were a lot of parallels between what he was doing and what some of the other artists in places like Paris were doing. There was a whole movement called the Figuration Libre, and particularly a guy named Jean-Charles Blay, who was also using posters and found paper things, and there is a long tradition of that in French art, post-World War II art. I think they called them the affichists. That's one of his images right there, the vomiting cow and the army man. Well, I was familiar with his work. I was kind of hanging around the East Village during the early 80s myself. One of the reasons that I kind of never really became a big fan of his work at the time was that there was always kind of an ugliness, kind of a brutality to it. And I always felt that he never really had a great color sense, although in the book they talk about going down to somewhere in Georgia and doing an installation with James Romberg and Margarita Van Cook, and she was talking about one of the reasons the colors were so bad is because they always used the cheapest colors they could find. I like this piece, and this is the piece that actually put me in mind of the Jean-Charles Blay piece. This is all glued paper and his maps, but he's taken those two head forms and boiled them down very nicely, and actually I thought that was kind of coloristically nice. Well, he had a very broad practice. He was a performance artist, a poet, a writer, a sculptor, a video maker, as well as a painter. One of the great things about the book is that it's almost like 3 stories in one. It's a biography of him, of David. It's a story of the rise and fall of the East Village art scene, and it's also a very tragic account of the AIDS epidemic, and David was one of the victims of that. Okay, here's a piece that I probably shouldn't tell you the title of, but it's Fuck You, Faggot Fucker, 1984. 4 black and white photographs, acrylic and collage paper on masonite. He was in a relationship with another fairly well-known East Village artist, photographer, Peter Huger, who was also had been in a relationship with another fantastic artist named Paul Thek, who was a superstar in the early 60s. It's a series of pieces that they're calling the alien heads. He made a mold and then cast, I guess, about 25 of these heads, painted each one of them individually. Some of them are collaged on, some of them are just painted. It's actually kind of strange to see these things through the lens of time. You see something like this in a plexi box in a museum, and it has an entirely different kind of character than it would have if it was sitting on somebody's coffee table in a grimy apartment on the Lower East Side somewhere. These are some photographs that Peter Huger took of David, and I wasn't aware of it at the time, but in certain ways David was also a model, and I think some of these photos were for a fashion layout and an article in the East Village about gay love in the late 70s, early 80s. Okay, so I've got the guard is coming up and informing me that he doesn't want to be pictured, so I made sure that I didn't catch him. This is actually a painting of Peter Huger, and again he will end up using this image again and again and again. This is on composition board. I think it's 48 by 96 inches. Much of the early work is done with stencils and spray paint, very flat, And he had kind of a natural, there's his burning house, he had kind of a natural graphic sensibility that is pretty good. And there's a certain amount of formalism there with the two rectangles, the two squares. This piece is titled Peter Huger Dreaming, Yoki Mishima, St. Sebastian, 1982, acrylic and spray paint on masonite, 48 by 48. In this painting from 1982, Wojnarowicz composes a meditation on male desire. His friend and mentor, Peter Huger, stretches across the bottom, reclining with his eyes closed, apparently dreaming the scene above. The image of the hypodermic needle is something that comes up now and then, and some of his self-portraits have him with needles in his arm. This is one of the main galleries of paintings, and as I was saying, we're kind of watching the arc of his career. So he started out as a kind of a rock and roller that was doing stencils. A lot of this was to advertise his rock bands, and at some point he got interested enough and was developing his painting style that he hit this period where he was actually doing large-scale painting. I think this is also about the time that he started exhibiting in the East Village. And as I said, he has a kind of repertory of images. There's the cowboy on the Brahma bull. Pictures of Jesus seem to pop up fairly regularly. He may have been Catholic, I'm not sure. I was talking about his childhood. Evidently, he was kind of abandoned by his parents at a very young age. I guess was in and out of foster homes. At some point he ended up in an orphanage, and I guess that his father kidnapped him and he took him to Michigan, but he was also abused by his father. At some point I think he reconnected with his mother, and at that point moved to New York. And I believe that he went to the High School of Performing Arts, so he had kind of a theatrical bend from the start. This is from page 312 in Fire in the Belly. David was beginning to consciously connect his family's pathology to a larger worldview. He added an anecdote in the eye about watching a cop kick a dope-sick junkie while arresting him. And I'm feeling rage, because in the midst of my bad mood, this cop is inadvertently reaching in with his tentacles and probing in ice pick fashion some vulnerable area from years ago, maybe when my dad took me down into the basement for another routine of dog chain and baseball bat beatings, or when he killed my pet rabbit and made me eat it. Bam, bam, bam. David didn't just identify with the junkie. If there was ever a time in his life when he was going to do more than dabble with heroin, this was it. One day after shooting up, David's arm turned green, and he showed it to Huger. They were sitting in a restaurant, and Huger told him, "I don't ever want to see you again." David gasped, "What?" "Don't ever come to my house again," Huger said. "I won't be friends with you if you're going to do that." David burst into tears. "I just feel so terrible about living," he sobbed. "I feel too self-conscious about living, and it's driving me crazy." Huger reached over and rubbed David's arm. David never used heroin again. I'll just briefly mention a little bit about the history of the East Village. Probably about the whole scene basically ran about 7 or 8 years from 1981 to 1987. I'm going to link an image below of a map that I painted of it a couple of years ago. During this 6 or 7 or 8 year run, I think there was probably something in the neighborhood of 120, maybe 140 galleries that opened. Most of them didn't stay open very long. There were also a whole community of artists that were living in the neighborhood. Mostly it was young people that had come to New York wanting to find the new bohemia, some kind of new artistic thing. A lot of it was dealing with punk rock music, new wave, no wave music, the new cinema, and many of them just got caught up in the scene. There was a lot of drug action. Gay liberation was becoming a very prominent theme, and there was also a mixture of kind of street art, students coming out of SVA, which was not too far away, and it was all a very interesting melange. This piece is titled Earth, Wind, Fire, and Water, and I believe this might be the largest piece in the show. This is 78 3/4 by 157.5 inches, and it's acrylic, spray paint, and collage on board. Mostly what united these people was the fact that they had been rejected by Soho, which was seen as the center of the art world and was one of the biggest communities of artists maybe in history. And at this point, Soho had already been functioning for about 15 or 16 years, and it had become ossified and sort of stuck in their own ideology, and it basically shut out a lot of the younger people. Also, as I was saying, there was a lot of European influences at the time, so things like bad painting, the German Neue Wilden or the Heftig painters, the kind of the Neo-Expressionists, the Italian trans avant-garde, the French figuration libre people, they were all popping on the scene, and so suddenly the East Village was a place where you could go and delve into the more expressionistic, emotional, romantic side of things, where Soho was kind of been sidetracked into minimalism, conceptualism, post-conceptualism, very dry, very intellectual. And he's collaged in some kind of foreign currency behind here. So this is about 1984-85, and this is when the AIDS epidemic really started to take out huge swaths of the downtown art community. That image of him with the sewn-up mouth is very famous. This is another gallery of some of his major paintings. I believe this piece is titled Water and is from the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. This is collage acrylic spray paint. And I believe that that hand coming out of the window like that is a reference to a Jean Genet movie. I think you could probably search on YouTube and find at least some snippets of that. I believe it was 1987 or 1988 that his lover, Peter Wojnarowicz, died of AIDS. And I know that David was involved for a couple of years in a very messy legal dispute with his landlord because he wanted to stay in Peter's apartment. I think it was on 2nd Avenue near 14th Street. And there were all kinds of questions about the lease and various other things. Again, here we've got his repertory of images. Instead of the flaming house, we've got a volcano, we've got the dung beetle, the brain, the burning man. Our radiant devil. And I think this is probably about the time that David was diagnosed with AIDS himself. And strangely, this is probably some of the more light images. We've got the clouds, the figures, everything is pretty. I guess that's a self-portrait there, is St. Christopher maybe? This is a little less dark. I think this is the series, I believe, was simply titled Sex Pictures, and I believe it was sometime in the late 80s that he was in an art exhibition with Karen Finley and Robert Mapplethorpe, and the NEA, somebody was protesting it, and the NEA decided to pull the funding for the show. He ended up suing the people that printed up a pamphlet because they had taken his images, cut them down so that they could kind of focus in on the sexual part of it, and he felt that that was a perversion of his intent. Wojnarowicz was in the hospital room when Peter Wojnarowicz died from complications related to AIDS. He asked the others who were there to leave so he could film and photograph his friend for the last time. The three tender images of Wojnarowicz' head, hands, and feet installed here came from this final encounter. If I had $1 to spend for health care, I'd rather spend it on a baby or innocent person with some defect or illness, not of their own responsibility, not some person with AIDS, says the health care official on national television. And this is in the middle of an hour-long video of people dying on camera because they can't afford the limited drugs available that might extend their lives. And I can't even remember what this official looked like, because I reached in through the TV screen and ripped his face in half. I was diagnosed with AIDS recently, and this was after the last few years of losing count of the friends and neighbors who have been dying slow and vicious and unnecessary deaths because fags, dykes, and junkies are expendable in this country. Well, now we're really getting into the part of David's career when he becomes an AIDS activist. And he spends a lot of time going to protests, writing poems and screeds. And I think that he was also helping to take care of some of his other neighbors that were getting sick at an ever-increasing number. This is, we are born into a pre-invented existence. Black and white photographs, acrylic string, and screen print on masonite, 60 by 48 inches, 1990. You can always pause your video and zoom in to read some of the text. And as I said, I was always under the impression that David was probably even more highly respected as a writer and a poet and a performer than he was as a painter. But I think this exhibition does a good job of showing that he was a very good painter. He was a very good painter. Also, I think this kind of is different. You know, these flowers, they don't have a lot of the kind of nasty imagery. There's no devils, there's no burning houses, there's no broken Kachina dolls. This is all pretty straight, beautiful paintings, or at least what society would consider beautiful paintings. I like this globe with the text printed on there. I guess you could sort of slowly go around and read that. I did a 360 view of that. I tried to. I think one of the other things that might be worth considering would be, why is it that suddenly in 2018, an institution like the Whitney has decided that they want to focus this kind of attention on David Wojnarowicz? And I guess the side part of that would be, why would they want to kind of reevaluate and look at what was happening in the East Village? This is all 30 years ago. And I think in a certain way it says more about where we are now, what we are allowed or encouraged to look at. This is a famous photo of David with the dirt around his face. One day this kid will get larger. One day this kid will come to know something that causes a sensation equivalent to the separation of the earth from its axis. One day this kid will reach a point where he senses a division that isn't mathematical. One day this kid will feel something stir in his heart and throat and mouth. One day this kid will find something in his mind and body and soul that makes him hungry. One day this kid will do something that causes men to wear the uniforms of priests and rabbis, men who inhabit certain stone buildings, to call for his death. One day politicians will enact legislation against this kid. One day families will give false information to their children, and each child will pass that information down generationally to their families, and that information will be designed to make existence intolerable for this kid. One day this kid will begin to experience all these activities in his environment, and that activity and information will compel him to commit suicide, or submit to danger in hopes of being murdered, or submit to silence and invisibility. Or one day this kid will talk. When he begins to talk, men will develop a fear of this kid, will attempt to silence him with strangling, fists, prison, suffocation, rape, intimidation, drugging, ropes, guns, laws, menace, roving gangs, bottles, knives, religion, decapitation, and immolation by fire. Doctors will pronounce this kid curable, as if his brain were a virus. This kid will lose his constitutional rights against the government's invasion of his privacy. This kid will be faced with electroshock, drugs, and conditioning therapies in laboratories tended by psychologists and research scientists. He will be subject to loss of home, civil rights, jobs, and all conceivable freedoms. All this will begin to happen in 1 or 2 years when he discovers he desires to place his naked body on the naked body of another boy. This is James Kalm reporting on David Wojnarowicz. History keeps me awake at night at the Whitney. You can like this, critique it, list your talking points below, suggestions, ideas. Like this and subscribe. And as always in our 14th year, thank you, Kate. Thank you.